My children thought I had lost my mind. At 71 years old, with a bad left knee and a fixed income, and 3 adult children who called each other every time I made a decision they didn't like, I drove 240 miles to a county auction in western Kansas and paid $200 for 50 acres of the worst land anyone had seen in that part of the state in 40 years. What I dug up out there didn't just change my finances. It changed everything my children thought they knew about their father, and everything they thought they knew about the land their grandfather had loved. If you've ever been written off by the people closest to you, if you've ever had a feeling in your bones that everyone else called foolishness, if you've ever been the oldest person in the room and somehow still the one no one would listen to, this story is for you. Hit that subscribe button. I've been waiting a long time to tell it. I want to start with the land itself because you need to understand what $200 buys you in western Kansas before you can understand why my son David called it to my face. At the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon, the dumbest thing I'd ever done. And David was not a man who used words loosely. 50 acres of high plains scrubland, no road access, the county easement had lapsed in 1987. No well on record, or if there had been one, no one knew where it was anymore. The soil profile showed alkaline hardpan for the first 4 feet, the kind of ground that breaks shovels and grows nothing but sagebrush and bitterness. There was a structure on the north end of the property. The auction listing called it a storage building, which was being generous. It was a Quonset hut, corrugated metal, built in the late 1940s, and it had settled so badly on one side that the south wall had pulled away from the foundation by nearly 8 inches. The listing photograph showed it backlit by a flat Kansas sky, sagging and rust-striped, with a padlock on the door that was itself rusted nearly solid. The county had taken it for unpaid taxes. The previous owner, the last recorded one, had died in 1991. No heirs had come forward. The parcel had been sitting in county limbo for 32 years before they finally put it up. $200. I was the only bidder. I drove home with a deed on the passenger seat and the particular quiet satisfaction of a man who has done something his children are going to hate. My wife, Margaret, God rest her, would have understood immediately. She always said I had a nose for things other people had stopped looking at. She would have said it the way she said everything. Matter of fact, no sentiment wasted, just the plain truth offered up like a cup of coffee. I missed her every day, but I missed her most in moments like that drive home when I had a thought I needed to say out loud to someone who would actually hear it. The Sunday call with my children happened 4 days after I filed the deed. I had mentioned the purchase to my youngest, Carol, thinking she might find it interesting. Carol told her brother David. David told my eldest, Ruth. And then all 3 of them were at my kitchen table on Sunday afternoon with the expressions people wear when they believe they are managing a situation. Dad, David said. He was using his measured voice, the one he used at work when he was explaining something to someone he considered a problem. You spent $200 on 50 acres of alkaline scrub with no road access and a collapsed building in western Kansas. The building hasn't collapsed, I said. It's settled. Dad, that's less than I paid for the lawnmower that's been sitting in my garage for 6 years. Ruth tried a different approach. She asked if I was sleeping well. Carol looked at her hands. David set his jaw in the way he had had since he was 12 years old, which meant he'd already decided the conversation was over and was waiting for everyone else to catch up. I didn't argue. I poured more coffee. I let them talk. I had no idea sitting at that kitchen table that what was already in the ground out there was going to bring all 3 of my children back to that same table inside of 18 months. Not to manage me, but to listen. I want to tell you about my father before I tell you what I found, because none of it makes sense without him. His name was Thomas Vance, and he was a wheat farmer his entire life. The son of a wheat farmer, the grandson of a man who had broken sod on that same stretch of high plains in 1902. He died when I was 38, a heart attack in the North Field, which was, I always thought, exactly the way he would have chosen to go if anyone had given him a choice. He was working when it happened. His hands were in the dirt. He left me almost nothing. The farm had been mortgaged against a bad run of years in the early 80s, and by the time the debts were settled, there was barely enough to cover the burial. What I inherited was a cardboard box. Inside it, his pocket watch, a photograph of my parents on their wedding day, a worn Bible with his notes in the margins, and a topographic map. hand annotated in his cramped pencil handwriting with a section circled in red ink and 3 words written beside the circle. Those 3 words were, "Worth the time." The section circled was in western Kansas. I had looked at that map for 33 years. I had driven past the general area twice in my life, once on a fishing trip with David when he was small, and once on my way to a funeral. The land out there looked like everything else out there, flat, dry, the color of old straw, and I had never been able to figure out what my father had seen in it or whether the circle was even specific enough to mean anything. Then, 6 months before the county auction, I had been cleaning out my attic, a project Margaret had wanted done for 15 years and that I had finally gotten around to, and I found the box again. I found the map, I spread it out on the kitchen table under the good light and looked at it the way you look at something you've been trying to read for a long time, and I finally noticed what I had missed for 33 years. On the back of the map, in the same cramped pencil hand, my father had written a set of numbers. I had always assumed they were field measurements or soil notations. He kept that kind of record. But I had a computer now, one my granddaughter had set up for me and taught me to use, and when I typed those numbers in, I understood. They were a legal land description, a parcel number for the county assessor's office, western Kansas. I called the county. It took 4 phone calls and most of a morning, but eventually I reached a woman in the assessor's office who confirmed that the parcel was in tax delinquency and was scheduled for auction in 6 weeks. $200. I was the only bidder. The drive to the property the first time took me 3 hours and 50 minutes, which is a long time to be alone with your thoughts when you're 71 and your left knee is complaining about the clutch and the radio keeps losing the signal. I drove the last section on a county track that was barely more than 2-wheel ruts through the scrub, and I stopped the truck at the fence line and sat for a moment before I got out. The sky out there is enormous. That's the thing about the high plains that no one tells you until you've stood under it. The sky is so wide and so flat and so completely present that it feels less like weather and more like a fact of existence. My father had stood under that sky and circled something on a map and written 3 words, "Worth the time." I stood under it at 71 with a bad knee and a deed in my jacket pocket, and I thought, all right, Thomas, show me. The Quonset hut was worse up close than it had been in the photograph. The rust was deep, the kind that has had decades to work its way through the metal, and the settling on the south side had torqued the frame so that the padlock door no longer sat square in its opening. I had brought a pry bar and a can of penetrating oil. I worked the padlock for 40 minutes before it gave. The smell that came out when the door finally swung open was overwhelming. Rust and damp earth and something organic underneath it. Hay or grain, long since gone to dust. I stood in the doorway and let my eyes adjust to the dark. The interior was larger than it looked from outside. The corrugated walls arched up 15 feet at the peak, and the floor was poured concrete, cracked, settled, but solid. Along the walls, wooden shelving had been bolted at intervals, most of it rotted to uselessness. An old cultivator sat rusting in the near corner, one wheel missing. At the far end, a wooden workbench ran the full width of the building, and above the workbench on the back wall, someone had cut a shelf into the metal and poured a narrow concrete ledge that ran the full width. On the ledge were 3 things: a rusted tobacco tin, a glass mason jar with a metal lid gone to oxide, and an envelope, sealed, addressed in pencil handwriting I recognized before I was close enough to read the name. My own name. In my father's hand. He had been dead for 33 years. I stood in the dark of that Quonset hut with the flat Kansas light coming in around the doorframe and my heart doing something irregular and very large inside my chest. And I said out loud to no one, "All right, Thomas, I'm here." I opened the tobacco tin first. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had done its job, were documents, legal documents, original pages, not copies, folded carefully, the creases gone soft with age. I set them on the workbench and smoothed them flat. The light wasn't good enough to read them properly. I took out the mason jar. Inside, sealed under 40 years of vacuum, were more papers, thinner, official-looking, with the heading of a state geological survey. And then I opened the envelope. My father's handwriting. I had to sit down on the edge of the old cultivator to read it. He had written it in 1987, he said. the year the road easement lapsed. He explained everything in the plain, unhurried way he had always explained things. No preamble, no wasted words, just the facts laid out in the order a person would need to have them. He had discovered the aquifer himself, or rather confirmed it. The geological survey in the mason jar was from 1979. He had hired a water surveyor on his own, using savings he had kept separate from the farm accounts, money he had put back over 15 years for exactly this purpose, because he had suspected since the 1960s, from the behavior of the ground and the way the scrub grew in certain low patches, that there was something beneath the surface of that particular section that the county maps didn't show. He had been right. What lay beneath those 50 acres was a pocket of the High Plains Aquifer, the great underground sea that runs beneath 8 states and has been feeding the plains since before the first farmer broke sod on it. In most places, the aquifer had been drawn down by decades of irrigation wells. In this section, protected by the hard pan above it, and by the simple fact that no one had ever found it productive enough to farm seriously, the water table was still deep and still clean. The survey estimated a sustainable yield significant enough to supply a substantial number of agricultural operations. My father had not developed it. He had been afraid of what would happen to the surrounding land if the water were extracted commercially, afraid of the corporate interests that had already begun buying up water rights in the region. He had let the parcel sit. He had hidden the survey. He had written 3 words on the back of a map and left it in a box with a pocket watch and a Bible, trusting that someday someone with his blood would find it and know what to do. His final line in the letter was underlined. He had pressed the pencil hard enough that I could feel the groove in the paper with my fingertip. Do right by the land, son. It always does right by you. I sat in that Quonset hut for a long time after that. The next 14 months were the most purposeful of my retirement. I had been drifting since Margaret died, not unhappily, though without direction, the way a boat drifts when the wind drops off and there's no particular urgency to get anywhere. The land gave me direction. It gave me work, which is what I had always needed more than rest. I hired a water rights attorney through a referral from a county extension office, a young woman named Ms. Albright, who had the brisk competence of someone who had spent years fighting large organizations and had stopped being surprised by anything they did. She confirmed what the survey said. She also confirmed that a company called Titan Holdings had been quietly acquiring water rights in the surrounding county for the better part of a decade and had already made inquiries with the county assessor about the tax-delinquent parcel before the auction. Inquiries they had apparently not followed through on, which she found interesting. They probably didn't know about the survey, she said. Your father hid it very effectively. I also found George at the farm supply in the nearest town, who recognized my father's name immediately and spent 20 minutes telling me things about Thomas Vance that I hadn't known, about how he had fought the county in the 80s over the road easement, how he had been known as a stubborn man who didn't sell what he didn't want to sell, how people out there still talked about him as a man who had understood the land better than the land understood itself. George let me run a tab. He also introduced me to a retired hydrologist named Roy, who drove out with me on a Tuesday to walk the property and confirm with his own equipment what the 1979 survey had said. Roy stood over the ground with his instruments for a long time, and then he straightened up and looked at me with an expression I recognized as the one people wear when they've just confirmed something they were hoping was true. Your father knew his business, he said. Son, you've got something here. Titan Holdings found out we were moving with the water rights documentation about 3 weeks before I expected them to. They sent a letter, then a representative, then 2 lawyers in a conference room in the county seat. The first offer was $30,000 for the parcel outright. I listened politely and said no. The second offer, which came inside the same meeting, was $175,000. I thought about my father pressing his pencil into the paper hard enough to leave a groove. I thought about the 3 words on the back of the map. I thought about Roy's face above his instruments, and George's tab running at the farm supply, and the enormous sky pressing down on that flat ground with the weight of everything that had happened under it. No, I said. I dictated our terms instead. Not a sale, a managed water access agreement structured through a regional agricultural cooperative that would be established specifically for this purpose, with the existing farm operations in the surrounding county as priority beneficiaries, with extraction limits set by an independent hydrologist on a 5-year review cycle, and with a portion of the annual access fees directed into a land conservation trust. My name would not be on the trust. The county's name would. The Titan lawyers looked at each other. I stood up. I was 72 by then. My left knee was still bad. I picked up my hat from the table and said, "I'll give you 3 weeks. After that, I take the survey to the county water board and we see who else is interested." They settled in 11 days. I called my children on a Sunday afternoon. Same kitchen table, same coffee. I set the signed agreement in the center of the table and let them read it, and I watched their faces move through the stages of understanding. Confusion first, then the first real comprehension of the numbers. Then something quieter and harder to name that I recognized as the thing that happens when you realize you have underestimated someone you love. Ruth was the one who spoke first. "Dad," she said, "how long have you known?" "About the aquifer?" "Since the attic," I said. "About the land?" "Since your grandfather died." He always said the worst-looking ground was just ground that hadn't been understood yet. David looked at the agreement for a long time without speaking. Then he looked up at me. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Carol laughed, a short, wet sound, and put her hand over her eyes. I poured the coffee. That evening, after they had gone, I drove back out to the property. The sun was going down behind the flat western line of the horizon, and the sky had gone to shades of copper and rose and a deep bruised blue at the top of the arch, the way the high plains sky does when it decides to be beautiful about it. I stood beside the Quonset hut with my hands in my jacket pockets and the deed in the inside pocket over my heart, and I thought about my father walking the same ground 60 years ago, pressing his boot into the hard pan and feeling something answer from below. The land was the same. It had always been the same. It had just been waiting for someone to pay $200 and enough attention. I stand at that fence line sometimes now, when the drive out doesn't bother my knee too badly, and I think about what my father understood that most people don't. That value isn't always visible. That the things written off as worthless are often just the things that require a longer kind of patience than most people are willing to give. That sometimes the best inheritance a man can leave isn't money or property. It's a map with 3 words on the back. It's the belief, passed down quietly through a family's blood, that the ground beneath your feet will tell you the truth if you are willing to stand still long enough to listen. Do right by the land. It always does right by you. I haven't forgotten those words. I don't expect I will. If you've ever been the one in the room that everyone else was trying to manage, if you've ever had a feeling that the people who loved you couldn't see, if you've ever stood on something that looked like nothing and known, just known, the way you know the smell of rain before it arrives, that it was worth the time, I want you to know that I understand exactly where you are standing. What is the ground beneath your feet that you haven't dug into yet? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. Thank you for listening.